Good evening. My research leads to a discussion of what the results of the Gaspee Affair were for the Americans and the British and how it led to the beginning of the American Revolution. We begin by recapping that the colonists were left to fend for themselves by the English, and Rhode Island created their own government and believed in their rights um, were accepted as a constitution. They believed that taxation could only be enforced by their legislation. The British incurred great national debt in the Seven Years' War. The British decided to keep 10,000 soldiers in American colonies to retain peace and maintain their stand. The British began incurring taxes on the colonists to offset some of this cost. The Americans thought these new taxes were illegal and unconstitutional taxes and put the American merchants at a disadvantage competitively. Lieutenant William Dudingston was ordered by King George III to patrol Her Majesty's ship, HMS Gaspee, in the waters of the Narrangansett Bay off Rhode Island. The HMS Gaspee was a British customs schooner charged with the duty of enforcing maritime trade laws, custom laws, and the Stamp Act. The British were increasingly becoming more hostile towards the colonies. The HMS Gaspee's commander, Lieutenant William Dudingston, was to prevent smuggling in the area, and he was despised by the colonists. Dudingston's crew and his crew harassed ships by using illegal military force and delaying ships unlawfully, adding to the turmoil that was brewing in this region. Dudingston would stop ships without cause, delay passage, he would loot goods, and inflict harm on the colonial sailors, adding to the already brewing tensions between the colonists and the British. So, around June 9th, the Gaspee was chasing the Hannah near Gaspee Point in Warwick, Rhode Island, and the colonists were tired of the harassment, so they decided to protest. Um, the Hannah, this was like a very meticulous, planned out um, affair where the Hannah led the Gaspee into shallow waters, and the Gaspee ended up getting stuck um, because the Hannah was provoking a chase in the bay. The Hannah basically did not lower their flags in respect for the British, which made the Gaspee chase after them angrily due to their resistance. And then once they were in those shallow waters of Namquid Point, well, today it's known as Gaspee Point, it stalled out on a sandbar that was well known at the time by colonists. And then the boat set out in the dark of the night as quiet as possible to avoid detection by the Gaspee. And the Americans loaded up on their ships quietly because they didn't want the Gaspee to fire their cannons off on them. It was that night that Joseph Buckland fired a musket that wounded Lieutenant Dudingston. The American crews boarded the Gaspee, went through his quarters, sacked the ship, and brought the British to the shore. The Americans burned the Gaspee to the waterline. The British were eventually let go a few days later, but this infuriated the British, and there was a reward offered to anyone leading to the conviction of the perpetrators. Um, Dudingston, coincidentally, right after his release, ran to the officials, and when he ran to the officials, they were actually angry at Dudingston and didn't like him, so they did nothing, even though he knew exactly who had was able to tell him exactly who had done it. They were not going to prosecute these people, so they were on the American side. So it's a really interesting story. No arrests were ever made, and this was the first shot in the American Revolution by the Sons of Liberty who were seeking justice. Dudingston and his crew tried to point out the perpetrators, but um, um, Dudingston, from my research, shows that they were charged with illegally confiscating goods. So this just made the whole tensions even worse leading up to the revolution. This was incidentally, it was about 18 months prior to the Boston Tea Party and the Boston Massacre. And it was a meticulously planned out attack that was carried out to protest the Gaspee and their actions in the dark of the night. Anyway, my research indicates that the Gaspee Affair leads to the unity of the colonies, the first start of the unity of the colonies, and the first stand in the American Revolutionary War for independence in America. So that's what I have for you. Some of the references that I'm using on this is Benjamin Armstrong's An Act of War on the Eve of Revolution out of Naval History, dated in February of 16. John Russell Bartlett, A History of Destruction of His Britannic Majesty's Schooner, Gaspee in Narrangansett Bay on the 10th of June in 1772. And then Fremont, John Fremont, The Sons of Liberty in 1775 and 1856 monographs of the Huntington Library in New York are my references.